In this tutorial, I will talk about business object groups, or simply object groups. Object groups is one of the poorly understood features of ORM, even though it's reasonably simple. When and why do you need object groups? Let's look at an example. Imagine that we're developing a CRM application that manages customers of our business. In this application, we want to capture all forms of communication with the customer. Letters that we send to the customer, letters that we receive, emails that we send to the customer, emails that we receive, phone discussions, personal meetings, and so on. So we need a business object that would store communication details. Which attributes do we want to add to this object? Well, first of all, the customer that the communication belongs to. Then the type of the communication, for example, received email, letter, meeting, and so on. Short description possibly, detailed description, date and time when the communication occurred, status of the communication. So far so good. But now imagine that we also want to capture the duration of a meeting or a phone discussion. We could add the duration attribute to the object, but this attribute is only relevant if the type of the communication is meeting or phone discussion, and it is not relevant to any other type of the communication. Or imagine that we also want to capture people who were put on the CC list of the email that was sent to the customer or received from the customer. Such attribute would be relevant only if the communication type is email and not relevant to other types of the communication. We can continue adding such attributes to the object, and we could end up with many attributes that are relevant to certain types of the communication but not relevant to others. We could live with this, of course. One of the solutions, for example, would be to create different forms for each type of the communication. We would then put only attributes relevant to a particular type of the communication on such a form, and leave out irrelevant attributes. Somewhere in the system, we would also define a process that would show the appropriate form depending on the communication type. For example, a process that looks like this. However, this solution is rather messy, especially if there are many attributes that are relevant to certain types only. The concept of the object becomes hard to understand, and we may end up with many situations where we would have to write additional rules and processes to handle different types of communication differently. An alternative solution is to represent communication with the customer as different business objects, one for each type of communication. So instead of having one communication object, we would have the outgoing letter object, the received email object, and so on. We would then have no need for the type attribute, as the type would be represented by the object type. Each object would then only store attributes that are relevant to this object. Each object would show its own form, and there would be no need to add different processes and rules to treat each type differently. Note, however, that all objects representing different types of communication will have quite a lot of things in common. They all refer to the customer, they all have short and detailed description of the communication, they all store the status of the communication, and possibly date and time when it occurred. Why is this commonality important? Because your application may want to perform queries or operations on all types of communication without distinguishing the communication type. For example, a user may want to see a list of all communication records with a particular customer in a particular time frame, irrespective of the communication type. How would we implement such a query if we had different types of business objects for each type of communication? The solution is object group. The concept of an object group recognizes the fact that some objects have certain things in common and allows performing queries and rules on the group rather than on an individual object. In this particular case, we would create a business object group called communication and add all objects that we have created to represent different types of communication to this group. I'll show you how this is done in the AwareIM CRM sample application. In this application, we have the business object group called communication. It has the following members: received email, contact note, outgoing email, and outgoing letter. It is very important that a developer who defines a business object group thinks about the attributes that will be common to the group and assigns the same names and types to these attributes. If no members have any attributes in common, the only attribute you can use for the group is the ID attribute that is by default common to all AwareIM objects. The members of the communication group have a number of attributes in common, such as correspondent, state, subject, contact time, and so on. They all have the same names and types. Once we have common attributes that have the same names and types, we can use the object group in queries and rules. Note that you can only use common attributes in queries and rules. Even if one member of the group does not have a particular attribute defined, you cannot use this attribute in queries and rules for the group, even if all other members have this attribute defined. For example, there is the correspondence query. That looks like this. This query will automatically retrieve instances of all members of the group that match the specified criteria. All attributes mentioned in the query are common ones to all members of the group. When we display the results of a query that uses business object group, we can only display common attributes. We can see that only common attributes are available for selection here. If we define an edit operation next to each record of the query, AwareIM will be smart enough to display the default form of the actual object represented by the record. So if the user clicks on the Edit button next to the received email, he will see the form of the email. And if he clicks Edit next to the outgoing letter, he will see the form of the letter. Let's write a process that will assign the same timestamp to the selected communication record, irrespective of the communication type. I will create a new process, give it a name. The process will have the communication business object group as process input, rather than any individual object. The rule of the process will assign current timestamp to the contact time attribute of the group. So I'm using the communication group here, and the context assistant here only offers me the common attributes of the business object group. So I select contact time, and assign the current timestamp. The assignment is only possible because the attribute is common to all members of the group. you won't be able to assign an attribute that is not common to all members. So the process will assign a timestamp to any communication record irrespective of its type. Object groups carry a certain performance overhead as far as queries are concerned. This is because the system has to perform a query on all instances of the object and perform a union of the results. So in some cases, when the number of attributes relevant to certain types or states is small, you may consider a solution without the groups if performance is critical. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about predefined object groups in AwareIM. There are two business object groups that are provided in AwareIM by default, and which play an important role in the architecture of the system. One of these groups is called System User. It represents a user who can log into the application. You can have many different types of users: customers, staff members, administrators, and so on. These users may have rather different attributes specific to the type. Yet the common thing about them is that they can all log into AwareIM using a login name and password, and they are assigned a particular access level after they log in. So there is a number of common attributes for members of this group: login name, password, access level, and so on. In fact, the System User Object Group mandates that certain attributes are present in each member. When you add a member to this predefined group, it is no longer up to you to make sure that some attributes have common names. If you add a member to the System User Group, the group will add certain attributes to the member whether you like it or not. So if you want your object to represent a user that can log into the system, you must add this object to the System User Group and live with the fact that certain attributes will be added to this object automatically. Apart from this, the System User Group is no different from any other object group. You can define queries and rules that deal with the common attributes. You can watch the Access Levels tutorial for more details about this group. Another predefined business object group is called Appointments. It is used to represent objects that can be shown on a calendar, scheduler, or a Gantt chart. The common part of such objects is that they represent appointments, or events, or tasks. In other words, things that have start time and end time, and also subject and description. Just like the System User Group, the Appointments Group mandates the existence of certain predefined attributes in each member of the group. So if you want to show your object on a calendar, scheduler, or a Gantt chart, you must add this object to the Appointments Group and get the group to add certain predefined attributes to the object. You can watch the Calendar Scheduler tutorial for more details about this group.